Hosting our discussion today is Mary Claire Ream, who is our Research Associate in Education Policy. She earned her bachelor's degree in political science at the College of the Holy Cross and is currently pursuing her master's in public policy at George Washington University with a concentration, of course, in education policy. She previously worked here at Heritage both as an intern and research assistant in the Center for Policy Innovation. She then spent a year teaching 6th grade at National Presbyterian School. Please join me in welcoming Mary Claire. Mary Claire.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to be co-hosting this event with our friends from across the pond in the Center for the Study of Market Reform and Education. This morning, we're going to hear why so-called best practices spurred by the PISA in a global context are fraught with policy shortcomings, and we'll gain a better understanding of how the OECD PISA moves from spurious correlation to policy recommendation. PISA scores measure the skills and the knowledge of students internationally, but have become widely interpreted as a measure of a country's education policy success. But is this good education policy? Or does PISA ignore the potential for free market solutions? And finally, we'll hear about what that implies for structural barriers to school choice and what options are out there to ensure a robust supply of diverse schooling options. Speaking to us this morning will be Gabriel Heller-Sahlgren, who is the Director of Research at the Center for the Study of Market Reform and Education, affiliated researcher at the Institute for Industrial Economics in Stockholm, Sweden, and a PhD student at the London School of Economics. He is the author of Incentivizing Excellence, School Choice and Education Quality, which discusses the conditions that need to prevail for choice to produce higher achievement, and The Real Finnish Lessons, the true story of an education superpower, published by the Center for Policy Studies. He is also the author of the paper Schooling for Money, Swedish Education Reform and the Role of Profit Motive, for which he was awarded the Arthur Selden Award for Excellence. Gabriel is editor of the CMRE's Monthly Research Digest and of Economic Affairs, a quarterly journal published by the Institute of Economic Affairs and the University of Buckingham. Next, we have James Croft, who is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Market Reform and Education, and is responsible principally for the organization's forums and outreach in respect of government, parliamentary, sponsor, key stakeholder, and practitioner engagement. James has authored and co-authored a number of reports for the Center and its partners, including Collaborative Overreach, Why Collaboration Probably Isn't Key to the Next Phase of School Reform, School Vouchers for England, Harnessing Choice and Competition for Greater Quality and Equality in Education, which was co-published with the Adam Smith Institute, and When Qualifications Fail, Reforming 14th through 19th Assessment in 2012. Previously, he was the author of Profit-Making Free Schools for the Adam Smith Institute. James comments regularly in the press on education policy. And finally, we have our own Lindsay Burke. Lindsay researches and writes on the federal and state education issues as a Will Skillman Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Burke devotes her time and research to two critical areas of education policy: reducing federal intervention in education and empowering families with educational choice. Burke's commentary, research, and op-eds have appeared in various newspapers and magazines, and she has spoken on education reform issues across the country and internationally, in addition to appearing on numerous radio and television shows. She has published evaluations of school choice programs and options for public policy foundations, such as the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and the Freeman Foundation for Educational Choice. Burke holds a bachelor's degree in politics from Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia, and a master's of teaching degree in foreign language education from the University of Virginia. She is also currently studying education policy as a doctoral student at the George Mason University. So I think Gabriel will start us off.
Can I have the clicker, please? Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for that kind introduction and also for inviting us to come and speak here about these important issues. Both my colleague and I are a bit flued up. We'll try to remain sane and not falling down during these presentations, but bear with us if we do. So yes, challenging the OECD PISA analysis. What I will do, I'll just speak for about 15, 20 minutes or so about PISA, what it is, problems with its analysis, a couple of examples, and then I'm looking forward to questions after everybody else's presentation. So we begin, the PISA survey. The PISA survey emerged really as a response to OECD countries' demands for a reliable metric of student performance It basically means, I'm sure you all know this, but it's just useful to recap, that every 3 years national representative samples of 15-year-olds in different countries sit a test in mathematical literacy, scientific literacy, and reading literacy. And this test, it differs from TIMSS, which was the original kind of international test. TIMSS is a more kind of, traditional curriculum-based test in science and mathematics, and it's been carried out to and fro since the 1960s. It's much less kind of, it didn't get as much attention in the media because partly I think the OECD has been quite good at its marketing strategies, but there was definitely tests prior to PISA. It's just that PISA became probably the most famous one. And the first results of this new test was published in December 2001. It kind of changed really the education debate. It internationalized it. Suddenly people looked at different countries. They were comparing, benchmarking each other. And in that kind of endeavor, we also saw these PISA shocks, as in Germany, countries that thought that they were good and in reality were quite poor or not as good as they thought, and kind of started a new debate regarding what education reforms they should do. Then we also had the PISA miracles, and the most famous one is probably Finland, which emerged seemingly out of nowhere because nobody cared about Finland prior to the first results in PISA. So when the PISA results came around, Finland became, well, kind of a superstars. But the OECD doesn't only publish the results, but they provide explanations as well. It tries to identify the education policy characteristics that are correlated with good and bad performance. So one of the chapters, it's normally the 4th volume of the PISA analysis, you can see this when they're trying to identify certain education policy characteristics across country and try to correlate that with performance. It also provides this type of best practice analysis a bit more kind of clean in the sense of that they have different kind of books targeted for different countries, and that actually includes America. So there are a couple of lessons from different countries, what America can learn from Finland or from Singapore or whatever it is. There are a couple of countries in there. And these analyses, they basically form the basis for this new type of education tourism that really has begun or started with PISA to understand what certain countries have done to produce these good scores. So people go to different countries and they report back, and many journalists do this. You can read, for example, in The Atlantic in 2011, there was a long article about Finland, and Finland keeps popping up also in the American debate, I know, and certainly in the English and the Swedish debate, with which I'm more familiar. Same thing with Singapore. So politicians say, oh no, we're going to go over there, we're going to bring back the mathematics kind of teaching from those countries, and I've seen the future, that it works, and all of those things, right? So the just brief conclusion there is that the PISA analysis and the best practice that's based on these scores have come to play an important part of the education policy landscape. And I think that's certainly true. It's certainly true in Europe, and it is true in America as well, although perhaps it's less visible in terms of policy circles. But there are problems with this. And the main problem is that the PISA report doesn't really do a good job of trying to tease out the causal relationships between the policy characteristics that they highlight and the student outcomes. It's basically filled only with high-level correlations. So they draw a couple of correlations between average student performance and a specific characteristic, and then they say, okay, this is, good systems are identified by doing this, right? And they do say in some of the footnotes, okay, this is, correlational, we have to be careful, but this is not how it's presented, and not in the executive summary either. So policymakers take this to be evidence for what they should do. Journalists take that as evidence for what the country should do to improve performance as well. That's why you can read in The Guardian, you can read in also, any newspaper really, what characterizes good systems and then drawing policy conclusions from that. And that's just problematic because, as any decent social scientist will point out, is that correlation is not causation. It's just very simple, okay? So that's the first problem. The issue here, it happens to be the case that this analysis is very often contradicted by more rigorous research that tries, there's some issues with that as well, but it's much more rigorous in the sense it tries to get to the causal relationships. One example here is this idea of private school competition. If you read in the PISA report, it says quite clearly there is no average relationship between the share of students in privately operated schools and performance. Now, there has been analysis using the PISA scores, published in Economic Journal, 2010, one paper there at least, showing that when you get down to it and try to do, use these better techniques to get to the causal relations, there's certainly an impact of private school competition, both among students in the private schools and among students in the state schools. Same thing with autonomy. In the PISA report, we read that, okay, autonomy is only good if it is combined with accountability. Now, you can think, but, it might be true that that's the case, but they can't show that. And it happens to also to be the case that there's a paper by Erik Hanushek showing, using much better techniques again, showing that school autonomy is good with or without accountability. Might be improved a little bit with accountability, at least in developed countries. So I'm just trying to highlight a couple of things here, a couple of examples that make it quite clear that the PISA report cannot be trusted for this policy analysis of trying to understand what the policy works. So the overall conclusion there is just that it's misleading explanations for countries' performance in PISA that you will find in the 4th chapter of the PISA report. The hunt for best practices, I mean, this is even worse, I would say, because with the hunt, this idea that you just look at good systems and you say, what characterizes them? Oh, okay, all these 5 countries. You pick a couple of 5, your favorite countries, and you try and say, okay, these things are all shared by these 5 countries. Well, that's even worse because there's no variation there. So you don't even know. If you don't go and look at the really poorly performing countries, those practices might be there. And in fact, most of the practices that are highlighted in the PISA report exist in most countries, in both high-performing and low-performing countries. So it becomes a cherry-picking exercise where you pick whatever you want and it leads you to whatever conclusion you want. So the point is, you have no idea if this chosen characteristic even correlates with performance. But it's highly unscientific. So, that feature that you choose to highlight, it might just even, it could have spurred, it could have been irrelevant for, it could have even hindered countries' education performance. There's no way of knowing. It's wholly unscientific, and it's very poor. We have a couple of examples here, just country-based analysis. I will take one example of high-performing country and one example of a low-performing country in terms of these explanations that are so, that become very prevalent, but nonetheless, and I think poison the education debate a little bit. First, we have Finland. Finland, of course, very high performing, or has been very high performing. It's been decreasing since 2006 in PISA. I've written this book, Real Finnish Lessons, which I spoke about yesterday at Cato, and I discussed this more in detail there. It's available free online, so you can download it if you want. If you're interested in this, it's a different kind of narrative. I'm just going to go through it. Not the entire book, but just a couple of this to illustrate the point. And the standard explanations for Finland's success was traditionally that it was due to the current education system it has. And one of the things that came out from that narrative was the absence of standardized tests, there was absence of school choice, absence of accountability, absence of market reforms in general. Or as Pasi Solberg, a guy who has a similar name to me, but by no means we don't share our opinions, that's for sure. He calls it germ. So one of the secrets behind the Finnish miracle was that the germ has infected all the Anglo-Saxon countries and also Sweden with a germ then. But the secret behind Finland's success was the germ hadn't come to Finland yet. And the flip side of that is that there's collaboration between professionals who have the autonomy to do their jobs well, so there's a lot of trust without any oversight whatsoever. So you don't need choice in that kind of situation. That's the theory. Competitive teacher education, 10% get accepted into teacher education. All teachers have to have masters, including primary school teachers, and this is supposed to generate great teachers with high status. Also, less is more. Final point, less is more is the idea that because kids in Finland don't have to study as much and teachers don't have to teach as much, children should do better. I don't know. That's the argument, because it gives them more time to collaborate. And it gives more children time to play, so if they can play, they can become better learners somehow. But the issue here is that nobody really questioned the timeline here. And there are other things, there are other problems with this, which are going through the book. But one of the key issues is that the timeline for these reforms don't even fit the Finnish miracle. I mean, until the 1990s, Finland's education system was centralized and traditional, with centralized inspection system, accountability, and a detailed national curriculum. Now, I'm not saying that that's the reason behind the performance, but I'm just saying this. Teacher education only reformed in the 1970s. In the mid-1970s was transferred from teacher seminars into universities. 1979 is the year when the primary school teachers were required to have master's degrees. And of course, this takes some time, right? It takes some time before this feeds into the system, before these teachers end up in the labor market, let alone dominate the labor market. So the question is, did Finland perform well before or after these changes? And it's quite clear that if you look at this picture, this is a standardized scores. I have more evidence in the book, but this is the easiest one. The country scores actually start improving well before any of the highlighted features came into effect, and they start declining soon after they're implemented. So you can see there, I mean, it started improving well before any teachers with masters at least the primary school level, could enter the labor market. So I doubt that that's the case, and I provide other alternative explanations for Finland's success in the book. This does not mean that it was the previous system that generated the scores. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you can't just look at the current system and say, ta-da, these characteristics are the reasons behind a country's success. Okay. Sweden. A more perhaps interesting example for the case of private school competition. Sweden, of course, has been performing much worse than Finland, and it's been declining both in PISA and TIMSS ever since late 1990s. At the same time as the share of students in privately operated schools have going up. And this is because of a voucher reform that we carried out in 1992. And we've seen an increase. About 14% of kids now attend, in compulsory education, privately operated schools. At upper secondary school level, it's higher. And this was about 1% back in 92. So it has increased. But the problem is that you see this, okay, you see an increase and you see the fall. So you take this to be a causal effect, and we do have example of this also in America. I mean, I think Professor Fisman at Columbia University wrote a piece in Salon, I think it was. Yeah, when he said this disaster of school choice in Sweden. And I replied to that, and some of the things that I, for the Friedman Foundation is represented here today, that this just ignores kind of the other million things that were going on at the same time. We have changes in teacher methods, from the more traditional education methods to more Rousseauian kind of child-centered stuff, which the research suggests can be quite negative, and I think is one of the key reasons behind Sweden's falls. Immigration is another thing that they completely ignore, which is a general problem with the PISA that you don't correct for demography. Second, first-generation immigrants tend to perform worse. And it happens to be the case that all research on the Swedish voucher reform suggests that independent school competition actually cushioned the fall slightly. The effects are not super large. We shouldn't expect them to be super large because the system is quite poorly designed in general. But it's certainly not the case that there's any evidence of negative effects. So the most recent study in Economica in July 2015 shows that a 10 percentage point increase in the share of students attending privately operated schools generate about 7 TIMSS points higher results. And I just extrapolated to show this quite clear, because there is this problem of it's counterintuitive. And it's difficult to explain to especially the media, who says, okay, well, it's been declining, whereas the private school share is going up, therefore, school choice doesn't work. Okay. But this is just an extrapolation of the estimates from that paper. You can show that with the actual increase, it's higher than the no increase. If you see over time, the TIMSS scores from 95 up to 2011. It's not that big, but again, we shouldn't accept them to be that big given the problems. And I'm not going to talk about the problems in the Swedish system right now. When it comes to other explanations, just briefly, I just mentioned immigration, which is the only thing that we now know has had any effect. I did this analysis this summer. It's been very difficult to discuss and I'm surprised that nobody did it before me. But essentially, it explains about 30% of the fall in PISA. Doesn't explain that much in TIMSS, but it does explain 30% of the fall. So you see the curve there with Swedish background, and then the all, you see the difference between them is getting bigger and bigger, especially from 2006 onwards. So you have these things when we have all these things going on at the same time in Sweden, and somebody chooses to emphasize that, private school competition has been increasing, it must be private school competition that has made sure that Sweden is falling in PISA. There's absolutely no evidence of that. This is just one example again. So a couple of conclusions. The PISA analysis and best practice ideas that have conquered the global kind of education movement ever since it was established are certainly fraught with problems. And I argue that we should put this best practice methodology on the dustbin of history, to paraphrase Lenin. It's absolutely useless. We need to understand that PISA scores do not measure education policy success. It is one metric, and we can discuss whether that is a good metric and whether we need other metrics as well. It's one metric of pupil success, not education policy success. And at the best, these correlations in the PISA report can be used to develop, kind of used as theory, to develop theory and say, if I find this correlation, maybe there's something there. That'll take the data, I use the methods, the rigorous methods, and I try and find out if this is causal. But by themselves, they cannot be used as evidence. So the final conclusion also that I argue in much more, because I'm doing a PhD at the moment and I'm banging on about this, that we need better experimental and quasi-experimental research to separate causation from correlation. I argue that the methodological imperialism of economics into other disciplines has been broadly beneficial. And I think that would be highly recommended. I mean, again, the PISA scores are useful for various reasons, but especially for analysis and for understanding how pupils perform, but they're not, if the OECD could just take a step back and do that, and then if they want to do the analysis, at least, do the analysis well, or don't do it all and leave it to other people to do that for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Yes, I'm James Croft, the Director of the Centre for the Study of Market Reform of Education. I'm not a principal researcher, but I managed to get a bit of research done recently, which was exciting. So PISA. PISA is a useful political tool. Declining results in the tests can be used to justify reform or service claims to policy success. As Gabriel has explained, the correlations are high level, and they're high level enough to allow great flexibility in the way they might be interpreted, and they lend themselves to some nice graphics with lots of crunchy data. If you get the right side of those graphics, so to speak, you have a very helpful narrative if you're a politician. So this potential was not lost on the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, who may be known to some of you for his reforming zeal, promising in respect of introducing more choice and competition into the British system. He jumped in with both feet in 2010, and he cited the PISA scores in just about every speech he gave, both in the run-up to the election and right through the period of the enactment and initial delivery of his school autonomy reforms and efforts to improve test score-based accountability. The OECD PISA narrative of 2009 gave him the case for change. Accordingly, by 2011, Andreas Schleicher, OECD PISA's ambassador at large, has become for Michael Gove the most important man in English education, to quote the minister. So when Andrew Schleicher visits the UK in early 2013 to discuss the emerging findings of that report, he's in a strong position to influence the trajectory of British reform. He places a strong hand on Michael's shoulder and gives him a steer. There's an even stronger correlation between collaborative culture and system success, he says, than that which pertains between school autonomy and performance. And accordingly, fostering such a culture is of crucial importance for professional autonomy to work. He can't substantiate the correlation because the stats aren't there in 4 volumes of the OECD PISA's report, and it's not something that they've looked at in enough detail to even define properly, but that doesn't matter, it seems. Well, Michael's not stupid. He knows that it's mumbo-jumbo and that he's being played. This is my theory anyway. But it's too late to expose the sham. He's bought into it too heavily. And he can also see the intuitive appeal of the idea and that the narrative of building capacity for improvement through sharing expertise, moving towards what has been described as a self-improving school system, will go over well with teachers. And so he does the deal. And the Department for Education press team, as we say in England, astroturfs for Andreas as he begins his annual media charm offensive. Well, unfortunately for Michael, in the final analysis, he's been outmanoeuvred. By 2014, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, reshuffles the cabinet, realising that choice and competition have been sullied once more in public opinion. And in the run-up to the 2015 election, he replaces Michael with an altogether more placatory figure in Nicky Morgan, the present Education Secretary, who makes it her mission to relieve teacher workload to free capacity for collaborative system improvement. Now, even more unfortunately for us all, there's no evidence that collaboration oriented to professional development and support actually translates to improved pupil outcomes. In fact, it's more likely that investment in collaboration mutes underlying competitive incentives, which inhere in the nature of reforms to give schools greater autonomy. But these issues in the research are not addressed in the OECD's PISA analysis. Instead, selected case studies, country case studies are offered, countries around the world where decentralization has been followed by the development of accountability frameworks and the encouragement of collaboration. These indicate diverse policy initiatives, but provide little detail regarding specific arrangements. The author's take is that it's probably the combination of various conditions rather than a single policy in isolation that is related to better outcomes in each country situation. But this nuance is lost in the broader best practice framework, which suggests that if you want to succeed, you'll do what these countries do. Never mind that no consideration is given to those that do these things and don't succeed, and indeed that we really have no idea as to the relative importance or unimportance of the various facets of the education systems described. Now, this methodological weakness of the OECD's PISA analysis, as well as being a feature of education research generally, is strikingly obvious in the literature on the importance of collaboration for school improvement. The literature internationally is overwhelmingly qualitative, and as such relies heavily on the judgment and authority of its authors in determining what's important to look at. And as such, it's especially vulnerable to the shaping influences of underlying value commitments, and thus producer capture. Teachers are posited as the guardians and arbiters of the public interest in education. They should therefore take an active concern for how other schools are faring and collaborate in a spirit of mutual aid. Hence, collaboration and networking are regarded as good things in and of themselves, regardless of the educational merit of the practices so disseminated. Research proceeding on this basis doesn't aim to test the impact of collaborative school improvement infrastructure on pupil outcomes. Only a handful of studies, literally single digits, out of somewhere in the region of 6,000 studies of school collaboration for improvement since the mid-90s, have even tried to address outcomes for pupils. Instead, the principal goal is to underscore the importance of collaboration between schools for staff development and support, professional collegiality, and for the maintenance of a particular conception of the public service ethos. The result is confusion around the nature and definition of what should be school's primary task. Now, the influence of the theoretical frameworks and underlying value commitments shaping practice in the area of collaboration influence school leaders towards local, in the main, towards local, small-scale and less binding formal arrangements, arrangements, which are designed to preserve participating schools' independence. And the evidence suggests that these arrangements do not spur improvements in pupil attainment. In the UK context, national audit and parliamentary select committee inquiries have consistently found that such arrangements are less likely to be subject to rigorous cost-benefit analysis. They're thus prone to a lack of clarity around objectives, what resources are likely to be required to achieve them, and to problems with oversight and accountability. This makes them time-consuming and potentially costly undertakings for teachers and for administrators alike, which may very well in turn deplete the time, effort and resources available for staff to focus on their own school and students. It's likely that this problem is only going to be ameliorated consistently in the school chain context, as scale frees resources for investment in quality control and management of inefficiencies arising from variable school performance within the group, but only where the structure is expressly designed to facilitate delivery of the improved outcomes for pupils. Proponents of collaboration often confuse chain and what we call federation effects with collaboration effects in the research, but these are entirely different, clearly. Recent research in this area, although unable to draw causal influences, has opened up promising lines of inquiry. The research suggests that those types of chain that are most expressly purposed to improving pupil outcomes and which have organized themselves to deliver are likely to be most impactful. Tightness of focus and management appears to make a difference. While far from definitive, this research suggests that corporatization may be more important than collaboration for school improvement, I have suggested somewhat controversially. In the UK context, there are options for schools, legally as well as more informally, as to how they relate to other schools. But due to the pervasive influence of unhelpful theory in this sphere, there may be much collaborative, and there is much collaborative trial and error involved before individual school leaders and governors actually become persuaded of the case to join a chain, to what we call hard federate. So in view of the evidence, we actually need to do the opposite of what Andreas Schleicher suggests. Under more competitive market conditions, the process of forging effective partnerships would be more efficient. Such partnerships would be likely to emerge alongside the establishment and growth of chains to precisely the degree to which competitive incentives are operable in the market. School autonomy reforms in England have already supplied many of the conditions necessary for more competitive collaboration. What is needed is more careful alignment of other features of the system to support trialling of different school curricula and changes to leadership, management structure and staffing, those facets of school autonomy that are consistently cited in the literature as crucial for improvement. There's much scope also for further progress towards more competitive provision in respect of liberalising school supply. What Michael Gove began was promising, but very, very restrictive in terms of the type of organisation that could participate in starting up new schools. Better information provision is also important. Reforms to the way schools are funded. We're not there yet in the UK with respect to a national funding formula. There's great regional disparities in the way schools are funded. The international evidence for the effectiveness of such reforms is persuasive and growing, but you won't hear OECD PISA saying that. Thank you.
Great. Well, if this is the two of you with the flu on your off day, I would hate to follow you when you're not sick. So thanks for being here. I want to consider this question from a little bit of a different framework today, take a bit of a different angle. So we are in the midst here in the US of a transformational shift toward choice in education. Our friends from CMRE can attest to the proliferation of free schools in the UK, which are analogous to charter schools here in the US. And then here in the US, we have about 59 private school choice programs operating in 28 states and DC today. So another way to think about that, of course, is that more than half of states now have some form of private school choice in place, whereas a decade ago, most children were assigned to schools in most states based on their parents' zip code. So choice is changing how we think about K-12 education for the better, and it's impacting the real lives of real people in states and cities across the country, and in some cases internationally as well. But one thing that Gabriel and James's remarks highlight, I think, is the rigidity of the larger K-12 system generally, whether here or internationally. Large-scale programs like PISA are why I think we need to start thinking about school choice through the framework of organization theory. And so just to go through this a little bit, one subset of organization theory that I think is particularly useful for thinking about school choice and how we consider the impact of policy on school choice is institutional theory. So you might have heard about this in terms of institutional isomorphism, which examines why organizations take on similar characteristics over time. So when operating under the same set of conditions, isomorphism holds that an entity will begin to take on the characteristics of other entities over time. This was famously put forward in 1983 by DiMaggio and Powell, and they identified 3 mechanisms of institutional isomorphism. The first that they identified was coercive isomorphism, which stems from pressures, whether formal or informal, to conform to the strictures of the existing system. A second facet that they identified was mimetic isomorphism. In other words, during times of uncertainty, organizations will copy other organizations, model their structure on other organizations, intentionally copying what other organizations do in order to gain legitimacy. I thought a cat picture would help with this deep talk. The third facet that they identified was normative isomorphism, which grows out of efforts at professionalization. So this is institutions unintentionally mimicking or copying other organizations in order to gain legitimacy. I think that James's remarks on collaboration actually would fit into this category quite neatly. So why does this matter for school choice? Why is isomorphism a problem? When it occurs, it fails to add diversity to a given sector. So in the case of school choice, isomorphism means limiting the variety of educational options that are available to families, and that's the simplest explanation. If this type of isomorphism exists, can we expect then to have significant diversity in schools of choice or in schools and private schools as a result of choice? Private school leaders may engage either intentionally or unintentionally in mimic isomorphism out of this normative idea of schooling, right? What education ought to be. Do schools, or will they, simply copy one another to conform to existing rules in order to generate social legitimacy? Are school structure constrained by the unwritten rules of what society considers schooling to be? So even in competitive markets, schools may copy the existing beliefs of the environment in which they operate out of fear that not doing so will create the perception that they are underperforming or failing schools. Sometimes that's an explicit requirement, falling under that first category of coercive isomorphism. Louisiana is an example of this coercive isomorphism. Private schools that participate in the Louisiana voucher program must have each student on a scholarship take the state test. We also know, as a result, that private school leaders worry that state testing mandates will change their school culture. It's possible then that the private schools that do choose to participate and are willing to incur these regulations end up looking a little bit more like the public schools that they were designed to be something different than. Again, this is that coercive component. We also know that fear of future regulations has led most private schools in Louisiana to sit it out, to leave money, tens of thousands of dollars, on the table every year and not participate in their statewide voucher program. Just 1/3 of private schools participate. This is a survey that Patrick Wolf conducted, and other authors as well, for AEI, that asked private school leaders why they chose not to participate in the Louisiana Scholarship Program. And so you'll see that fear of future regulations was their #1 reason for sitting it out. And you'll see a little, I know it's difficult to see, but a little further down, you'll see that testing requirements also made it high on the list. So state testing mandates could have 2 negative implications for the market of available schooling options, as seen in Louisiana, that the options that end up being available don't look sufficiently different than the public school options that exist. And then the second implication is that private schools just choose not to participate at all, thereby limiting the available supply and by extension the choices that are available to parents. And Louisiana is but one example. When we consider all of the structural elements that exist today to judge school performance, whether PISA, state tests, things like Common Core, there is significant coercive pressure on private schools to copy existing practice. Yet, of course, we're all here, so we know that existing practice is not working very well. So this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress's long-term trend assessment. We know that mathematics and reading achievement has been flat since the 1970s. I know it's hard to see, but you can see reading achievement in red at the top there and mathematics achievement in blue at the bottom. And particularly if you look at the top lines of each, those are 17-year-old students. Those are your high school seniors, more or less. And you can see that outcomes have been wholly flat, particularly in reading, since 1971, when the test was first administered. We can dig down a little bit deeper into this and see it in an even more problematic light. If you look to the left there, 25% of U.S. high school seniors, 25%, are below basic in reading today. It's 1/4 of high school seniors are below basic in reading. So we know existing practice hasn't always worked very well to produce the types of outcomes we would have hoped. So I mentioned at the beginning that 28 states and DC now have private school choice options in place. What I didn't mention is that 5 states, Nevada, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arizona, now have education savings accounts in place. And I think if we're considering how to structure school choice options in a way that encourages the most robust supply of available options in the market, that education savings accounts are really a great way forward for states who are thinking about it. Just quickly, if you haven't come across ESAs yet, they are sort of the new kid on the school choice block. Arizona became the first state to adopt them in 2011. And just quickly, a parent gets a restricted use debit card. In the case of Arizona, funds go onto that card. Different mechanisms in different states, but parents get a portion. In the case of Arizona, it's 90% of what the private schools would have spent, or what the public school system would have spent on their child. And the student can then use those funds for any education-related service or product or provider. So they can use their Ed Savings account to pay for private school tuition, online learning, special education services and therapies, textbooks, curricula, private tutors. They can even roll over unused dollars from year to year, and in some states can roll those unused dollars into a college savings account. So that ability for parents to direct every single dollar that's in their account, and in some cases to save money, and in some cases to roll those funds into a college savings account, really helps ensure diversity of supply. And just quickly, I'll end. These are our friends, Max and Mark Ashton, who are in Arizona. We had the opportunity to go and meet with them and talk to them a couple of years ago. And I just love the way that they have used their education savings account in Arizona. Max, the student there, is legally blind, and he was in the public school system in Arizona and said, it was working pretty well for me. He didn't have any major complaints with the system. But in 2011, when the education savings account option came on board, they decided to take advantage of it. And I love the way Max's dad, Mark, talks about it, because he says for 90% of what the state was spending, think about ed funding, right? Federal, state, local. This is just 90% of state dollars. We were able to pay for what they say is the best private school in Arizona, Brophy Academy. They were able to purchase all of Max's Braille, his assistive technology, everything that he needed to be successful. They still had money left over after all of that to roll over, and rolled it over into a college savings account and are now paying for tuition at Loyola Marymount. And so I just love the way Mark talks about it. He says, for all of that, right, for 90% of what the state was spending, we were able to get all of this. So it really does show, if we move away from our preconceived notions about how education financing must be structured, if we do, as Milton Friedman suggested, and separate the financing of education from the delivery of services, we have a real opportunity to see a much more robust supply of providers. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I'm going to do Q&A from the...
Sure, yeah, so I think we have time for a few questions. We have a mic floating around, so just raise your hand and please identify yourself, and we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Will Estrada, I'm with Homeschool Legal Defense. My first question is for Gabriel. How would you say that education policymakers in the United States should use the PISA test? And then my second question is for Lindsay. Lindsay, could you go over again the percentage of Louisiana private schools that are refusing to get into the bachelor program? And the second question, Lindsay, would be, how do you fix that?
Yeah, this is on, yeah. It's a difficult question. I think, as I highlighted in my remarks, that you can use the PISA scores as one metric, and one metric alone, to understand how American kids perform in comparison with other countries or the pupils in other countries. Now, PISA is a specific test. It measures these, well, new skills. The idea is that it measures new skills that are necessary for the 21st century. I'm not sure how they would know what is necessary for the 21st century. And quite frankly, PISA is much more, or the performance in PISA is much more heavily dependent on reading. So I think, specifically the PISA scores, you should also look at TIMSS. You should look at any available metric that you have. You have NAP as well, so you can do even further, more longitudinal analysis. I'm just saying, if you're going to use them at all, apart from just seeing how we perform and actually try and change education policy, you need to hire some people who can analyze the data and see how can we reform the system for the better to get PISA scores higher. But the question then is that the thing you want? Because policymakers appear, and many people appear, to be quite schizophrenic about this. Because they say, on the one hand, we want higher PISA scores. On the other hand, they say PISA scores that's not the only thing that matter. So I think the first thing we need to do is to discuss what we should focus on in education and what the policymakers want. And it is dangerous to focus too much on these scores. And, if you want to change the curriculum to focus highly on PISA, yeah, sure, you can do that. New Zealand did that, and they performed very well, and then suddenly they fell. Finland's, obviously, curriculum is more aligned with PISA than with TIMSS. Incidentally, the American curriculum has been more aligned with TIMSS. So I'm just saying, it's very difficult to give a straightforward answer, but I say if you want to use them as one metric alone, not the only one. And if you actually want to bring forward education policy solution based on that, you need to do the analysis well. And that means maybe hiring economists at top-level universities, which you have many of here in America, rather than giving the analysis to the OECD.
So the answer is 1/3. The proportion of private schools that choose to participate in the Louisiana Scholarship Program. So 2/3 of them are sitting it out. As far as what to do about it, so as I briefly mentioned, but Louisiana's regulatory environment is incredibly heavy-handed, right? So not only do they require private schools to take the state tests, which, as I mentioned, private school leaders worry will end up dictating their school culture and their curriculum, but there are requirements on teacher certification, on private schools reporting every day if there are absences on the part of scholarship students. The list goes on and on. So I think first and foremost, removing most of those heavy-handed regulations is important, but what do you do in the absence of that? My preference is the Arizona model, which, and again, I think we've talked about this before, but it's a matter of how we think about accountability, right? That we have two types of accountability: accountability for outcomes and then accountability for taxpayer dollars. And if you look at Arizona's Ed Savings Account option, they said, yes, transparency, accountability for taxpayer dollars. Parents submit receipts quarterly. If there's a misuse of funds, the state can rectify it by withholding the subsequent quarter's distribution. They reserve the right to audit individual accounts. So there's strong transparency in terms of financial outcomes. On academic outcomes, and this is where I think Arizona struck a really great balance, was they said, you know what, we recognize that first and foremost, parents are their child's best and most important educators and have their child's interest at heart. So parents have to sign a contract that they say they will provide their child with an education in the core academic subjects, but Arizona did not layer on a state testing requirement. Now, the question is there maybe somewhere in the middle for folks who would like middle ground, and I think the middle ground looks more like Nevada. So Nevada, and I really glossed over this, but Nevada became the 5th state to adopt ESAs. They did it in July of this year. And when they did it, and I should mention, it's a near universal program, right? We've never had a near universal school choice program ever. So I can't tell you how amazing it is, and I think about it all day long. It's sad. But every single child in Nevada public schools will be eligible for an ESA. That's 93% of their state population. It's 453,000 kids in Nevada. Since they have such a large population, since it's near universal, and I say near because private school students who are already in private schools aren't included in the option yet, but they said, well, let's have a nationally norm reference test requirement in place so that down the road, let's say there is 50% uptake, whatever it might be, we can assess how Nevada kids are doing. But they get a choice of parents get a choice of nationally norm reference tests. And if you talk to private school leaders, they're far less likely to say that an NNR requirement will dictate local school curricular decisions. So I think that that's probably a good balance for Louisiana.
Thank you, guys. That was a wonderful presentation. I have 2 quick questions. So the first one, Mr. Croft, you talked a little bit about Mr. Gove introducing autonomy-free schools in Europe. Can you talk a little bit more about why he shifted from that and wanted to move more to the collaborative model? I'm sure there are a lot of explanations for that. Go over that really quickly. And then the second question, and maybe Lindsay, you'll be the person to address this, but the PISA scores. So I heard about this for the first time this summer, but I haven't really heard about it from a U.S. education policy perspective. Are we looking at this coming down the pipeline? Is the Department of Ed considering something along these lines?
The shift, it wasn't so much of a shift, a deliberate shift. What I was trying to illustrate in the narrative there is basically how he got positioned by his own use of PISA and sort of backed into a corner a bit. I spoke about the work of his own press team. What they did is they released a script of a talk that he'd given a year previously in the company of Andres Schleicher, where he talks about him as the most important man in education. And it wasn't made public until a year later, in fact. But what he does is he starts speaking about what's going on within the context of the academies, which are the newly autonomous schools, and the academy converters, and in the context of the chains, as collaboration. So you get this deliberate political confusion of terminology that is designed to basically make it all look like it's an investment back into, if you like, a reformed relationship, a newly cast reformed relationship, but essentially it's all the same thing, So you get this sort of blurring, and we're trying to sort of clarify this because actually the research on academy effects, on chain effects, is a specific field now, and it's much more quantitative research. I mean, it doesn't take you all the way. It's essentially what we call using matching methods of varying degrees of quality methodologically. But it is still much more, it's much more oriented to actually discovering impacts for students than anything that you'll find in the collaboration literature. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of trying to flesh out how this works to create confusion at the policy level.
They basically say
in the
what
end, he was taking advantage of.
They basically say what actually is a takeover is collaboration. That was to say, because there is no evidence on collaboration really. So they talk about it, there is some evidence, but in fact even the correlation, I haven't looked at this, but you say, James, that there's not even anything in the PISA report on collaboration. So I have no idea what they're actually referring to.
Yeah, sorry, to answer your question, so the US has participated in it year after year. This is where you see, or when you hear people say, well, the US ranks in the middle of the pack, it's because they're referencing things like PISA and TIMSS. Now, I don't think we suffer as much as our European friends from this pool of best practices from other countries yet. I mean, and we certainly see it from time to time. I just don't think to quite the extent that you've experienced it. Not that that couldn't happen. And of course, if you have followed the course of Common Core at all, this is part of the underlying push for it, right? Is we don't perform well internationally. So it certainly had an impact here. So I think it all just depends on what policymakers glean from it and whether we should consider them to be best practices or not. I think we've got time for one more question.
Thank you guys so much. Brittany Corona from the Freeman Foundation for Educational Choice. So I have two questions as well. First one, and it's actually, anybody can answer this. So one of the things that I find really interesting about your presentation is looking at the shift in different approaches to pedagogy from the more traditional model that's a teacher-led, this is going off the Common Core remark that Lindsay just had too, going to more of the student-directed, student-led models. And especially when you're looking at the Finnish model and the shift that happened from that traditional models of pedagogy and the centralization, we always point to that, or PISA tends to, or those who reference PISA tend to point to that as the reason for their success. But your argument would also be the shift towards the student-centered model is actually when you start seeing that move away. I think one of the problems in America is we tend to separate those two in ways that the European models don't because of the best practices collaboration, in the sense of we look towards the market reform. We do have a more federalized system of education. So we look at that and then we separate that from the pedagogical reform that Europe tends to focus on much more. Can you speak to that and how market reforms in education play into the pedagogy conversation and how you can explain some of the correlation type of metrics as opposed, it's not a causation issue as you've pointed out, but there are some questions in regards to A, market reform, and then B, pedagogy reform too, because that is a huge conversation here in America too, especially as it pertains to national standards. The second question, real quick, would be also looking at qualitative metrics of student achievement, which I know you've done, all three of you have done a substantial amount of research on as well, moving away from just looking at traditional math and reading scores and what that would play into, how Europe understands that, and particularly England understands that, and how America is also shifting to look towards more qualitative metrics and how you assess student achievement.
Regarding the pedagogy, I mean, many of these ideas of child-centered methods came out of America. I mean, John Dewey is one of the kind of, principal people that have been, and it's been spreading all over the world. England is another country. Now, these ideas have really captured the education establishments everywhere. And when how it plays out in terms of, Finland, if you want to talk about that. Well, Finland has been cited in the media as this kind of, very progressive, it's child-centered, but it's been, when it's performing well, it was very traditional. And now they adopted these practices. Of course, it takes some time. Like in the early 90s, these reforms that are consistently cited as the reason behind their success, they were also pushing for these new methods. Luckily, the professionals were refused, and they were at the same time given autonomy to refuse. So had it been maybe 10 years earlier, it had been very difficult for them to refuse. Now, we have in Sweden a similar situation, apart from that they couldn't refuse because it was enshrined in the national curriculum, the idea of pupil influence, to the extent that you now can't have a school that has core values that you can't change. So the pupils have to have a say in anything. And so they break the law. It's in the education law. So these things obviously circumscribe choice. And this is the thing. When we talk about the Swedish system, even though despite all of these problems, it's led to some marginal improvements. But I mean, I thought this was, I mean, my colleague Tino Sanandaji wrote in the National Review in response to this, Professor Fissman as well, if we're free to, if somebody, choice wouldn't necessarily lead to no Rousseauian methods, that's not the point. But the idea it doesn't lead to system collapse completely, because I argue that those things are probably the most important reason why Sweden fell. And I also think they're to a certain extent, I mean, there's some evidence that they are certainly related to Finland's fall. That's the only education policy lesson that I draw from Finland, really, that we can draw away, that the old methods actually work to produce these scores. Then I try and make it a bit more nuanced, because obviously we don't only care about test scores. So these other methods might be good for other things. The point about choice, I'm not against innovation in education. I'm just saying we need to test them first. And that has been a consistent problem in education, that it's been difficult to test. So instead we subject the entire country to a gigantic experiment, which there's no turning back from. So I think that's pretty much it on the pedagogical methods. I don't know, was there anything else on the? No, that was the one. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll probably end there.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.